說到嘢要嘛，我好歡喜我今日喺處啊，但係我想跟你解密立體之城，is that up there？ 解密立體之城。As I said, my 普通話 is not very good, sorry. However, I will speak in English. It's easier for me. I'm going to talk to you about volumetric urbanism. Where do I start? Imagine you have the opportunity to create a new neighborhood. What do? You see a clear ground. That's where new neighborhoods often start. It's a large piece of ground, has 4 highways around it, and it takes 20 minutes to walk across from one side to the other. That gives you some idea how big this territory is. Now, what are you going to do? In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through the mental exercise of how you might create a new neighborhood. This exercise will stretch your brain. It'll be difficult, but it needs a good imagination and a capacity to hold many ideas in your head at the same time. And these ideas will often compete with each other and contradict and deny other facts. You've been asked to make an exciting neighborhood, a creative neighborhood, a neighborhood that the country depends upon because you need creativity and innovation and inventiveness everywhere. We all find variation very attractive. We get excited by diversity and variety. A meal of plain bread is boring. But what makes cities exciting is the diversity of the activities they support. It's a collection of the most outrageous shapes in a city. Demanding our attention is not exciting. It's the activity, it's the people. Your neighborhood will attract young people, people like you, people like me, children, retired people, because a richly mixed neighborhood is what is vital. In other words, we must have different kinds of attractors, different kinds of spaces, different kinds of opportunities. So if you do that, then you are on the way to designing a great city. You need to give shape to this neighborhood. Do some simple geometry now. You need to house many people and many activities, shops, cinemas, schools, clinics, and all the other services that are needed in a neighborhood. You need to start pushing the buildings up from the ground. So you start to draw. You draw on the ground, you draw a shape. And then you pull these shapes up out of the ground. So first, we'll make a rectangle. And that rectangle is pulled up out of the ground. And that's your shopping center. Very simple. Now you do another shape on the ground, and you pull that even higher. And that's an office building. Let's say it's 60 stories. Okay? Now we do the next one. You make another shape on the ground, and you pull that one up, and you make that 45 stories. So now you've got shopping center, housing, office building. And that housing will have 45 floors, 6 apartments on each floor. That's 250 houses. That's 1,000 people in one building. Are you on your way now to creating a neighborhood? Make that a few more times. So 1,000 for each building. You've got a couple of office towers, and suddenly you've got a neighborhood. So in a few towers, you've laid out a part of a neighborhood. Let's carry on then. I'm working conceptually here, where there's not an awful lot going on. You're trying to work with basic shapes. You obviously need some ways to move around the neighborhood, so you put some roads into the neighborhood, and you start arranging the territory so there are bus stops and car parks. You'll need to put a garden around it a bit, and at the base of the building, you need to fill out some of the areas you expect for community, and maybe you will add some trees down the middle of the road, and on it goes. In a few minutes, just a few minutes, you've created a whole new neighborhood for 10,000 people to live and work in. Copy that 6 times, and you've got 60,000 people Designing is hard work. So now you could stop. Think in your mind, what does it look like? What have you done here? Well, when I did this, and I stopped, and I ended up looking like just any other neighborhood in any other city. Nothing was different. It could look just like this. Something's missing. This is not exciting. This is not that creative. So let's try again. Let's put that design aside. We start with a blank piece of ground again. And before we start, let's look at our assumptions. We don't only describe what we know. And one of the hardest challenges in designing is to conceptualize what we never experienced. Sometimes, though, it's even harder to see what is in front of us, but we can't see it. So let's look closely at what we might find. The site is not flat. Don't assume it's straight. And we could use those changes of height to our advantage. When we are tourists, for example, we like to visit small hill towns with their narrow streets, and we like to walk through between the buildings. We want to experience nature. We all go to city parks and country parks, and as you get started making buildings, you're taking away from the possible land for the park or the countryside. In both of these statements, though, are false. Why can't we make a neighborhood where parks are part of the whole building? Why can't we make a neighborhood that's exciting to walk through, like a hill town? What else might you like? Well, it'd be good to have some streets. Streets you can walk around, see your friends, maybe dance in the streets. Restaurants, they have tables outside. It's good to walk to work and then to walk and party later. So let's start designing our neighborhood again. Instead of making individual towers, we'll start making a different approach. In our first city, the city blocks would have been about 100 square meters. So maybe it'd take 10 minutes to walk, a minute to walk from one corner to the other. Instead, let's start with that basic grid. You break it down into two, and you make two long rectangles, each about 6 or 10 floors high. And in the lower floors, you put the shops, and maybe the offices, and then the housing above. And at the higher levels, you can put more of the residential accommodation. So, by studying the neighborhoods of cities, including Hong Kong, we found that this is a common size for city blocks. So we start laying it out with the gardens on the roof, and you can walk across the buildings instead of along the ground. You can connect the buildings at different heights, so you can walk through and around and up and down. And since the ground is not flat, you find the buildings rise and fall as well. And some buildings might be taller and some might be shorter, from 6 to 12 floors. So you get a park on a roof, and the roof becomes part of a hillside. And even where the ground is flat, you can make your roofs rise and fall anyway. So, if there's a hillside nearby, you can build a bridge that allows hikers to walk from the hill onto your buildings and off onto the hills the other side. Now we'll twist the blocks a bit, and you start keeping the apartments cooler by having the wind blowing through. You make the bits of the building wider so they hang over and provide some shade. And here, in this, we have created a neighborhood for 200,000 people with 45 blocks. But here, nothing is taller than 15 stories. The streets can be lined by activity. You can walk through and around the buildings or below them. So here's the question now. Where is the ground? The ground has been multiplied. You multiplied it by inventing a new kind of ground. You've taken an experience you might have had walking through a hill town, and instead, this hill town, which has a marketplace and small streets, you translated that experience into something more vertical. And it takes up less land. And then we invented new ways to wander through the building. So it's not restricting ourselves to the elevator going up and down, but we're able to walk on the outside of the building. So what else is different? Well, we've not split up the activities. We haven't put the factories in one place and the housing in another and the schools in the other. That's called zoning. And zoning is not a way that we normally work. It's a concept that was introduced 120 years ago in Europe, but it's not necessarily relevant today. So this city, where you walk over and through and around the buildings, is more like a Western meal. where in a Western meal, everybody gets one plate, and they get their food, but it gets boring. Instead, it's like a Chinese meal. You get to share the food. You get to decide how much you want of one thing or another thing. And so it becomes an interactive city instead of divided up into portions. And indeed, this is the way things are going to work. Cities in the future are not going to be divided so much around separating the work from the residential. We're mixing ourselves. And so the spaces can mix in throughout the volume of the city. So the roofs of one building become the gardens for another. And you can start wandering through the city by climbing up and down. These connections together, ideas that we observe in many cities around the world, but they first came to me when we were analyzing Hong Kong and thinking about the way Hong Kong worked with its hillsides and its connections and the things you can do inside buildings, on top of buildings, and how buildings are connected together. So, in this brief review, we've visited Genoa, we've visited Paris, we've visited Hong Kong in these pictures, but they're all creating this concept of the volumetric city, this concept that I started at the beginning. 解密立体之城